How did people in history overcome armoured opponents? One answer: specialised daggers. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms as well. Now, I've recently come into possession of a new specialised type of dagger, which you're going to see later in this video, and more about that a little bit later. But it's inspired me to make this video talking specifically about daggers against armour. Now, this is a topic which obviously I've covered to some extent in previous videos, but I noticed recently in a discussion that was actually about armour, the prevailing opinion amongst particular armour aficionados that essentially armour made you quite impervious to certain sorts of attacks. And indeed, you might remember back a video that I did with Todd of Todd's Workshop and Todd Cutler, where we tested, and this is a Todd Cutler dagger, but we tested one of his custom pieces, one of the custom Todd's Workshop daggers, against various types of armour. Now, we tested against padded garments, which did nothing at all to stop it. We tested it against mail, riveted Indian-made mail, and I'll come back to that point in a second, and basically it did nothing. It went straight through that. And finally, we tested it somewhat controversially against sheet steel, which mild steel this is. It wasn't hardened, and I believe it was about 1.5mm thickness, and it could have been 1.2mm, but anyway, 1.2, 1.5mm sheet steel, and fundamentally, much to our surprise, it went through. Now, we didn't expect it to go through to the degree that it did, and we had a very interesting discussion about that. And first of all, let's talk about the armour itself. So talking about the steel plate, and let's talk about the mail. So obviously iron plate, steel plate and mail, particularly chain mail, are very common types of armour across a big part of history and across certainly Europe and Asia and parts of Africa as well. And I think a lot of people assumed, myself included, that you couldn't just take a rondel dagger, which is one of these, and jam it through sheet steel. Now, obviously you can jam it through very thin sheet steel or iron, you know, 0.5mm thick. Yes, we all know you can stick it through that. I think anybody who's played around with shooting arrows into bits of metal has got a rough idea of what pointy objects do to sheet steel when it's thin, and something like a car door or car body material is very thin. But once you start to get above, you know, sort of 1mm and above that, I think the assumption is usually that's enough to stop a sharp point. Turns out not under certain circumstances. Now, there were obviously mitigating circumstances. Yes, that was a flat sheet. Yes, it was on a stable downwards and, you know, a table essentially, a stable kind of surface. Is not the exact same analogue to punching through steel plate that's like on a knight who's trying to hit you with a poleaxe in the head. Okay, completely accept that. So when steel is work hardened, and obviously if it's heat hardened, and when it's curved and when it's on a moving body, all of these kind of things definitely change things. But the real headline here is a flat sheet of modern mild steel, which is actually more homogeneous and tougher than, let's say, a lot of medieval armour, because a lot of medieval armour was actually quite slaggy. In other words, it had inclusions in it, iron or very low carbon steel. Actually, that piece of mild steel was a pretty good analogue, and in fact better than some medieval armour. So we were surprised. But should we have been? Well, the simple fact is, if we look at treatises, if we look at medieval history, we look at medieval art, we look at medieval archaeology, we can see that indeed there is actually quite a lot of evidence for the fact that armour was penetrated by stuff. The very fact that they used to test armour with crossbows, and in some cases hand bows, longbows, and other things as well, daggers, and we've got illustrations from art of mail shirts being tested with daggers. They did this in period, and we know there was also a proofing system that led it to the later expression bulletproof, where they were testing breastplates against pistol and sometimes even musket rounds in later centuries. But this had its origins in the medieval period, where armour was tested and proofed. And indeed, there are ordinances, there are essentially regulations specifying that certain armour had to be tested in certain ways to prove that it worked against certain weapons. Brigandines, breastplates, helmets, all sorts. Mail shirts as well. So We also know, of course, that there were specialised weapons, and that's what the main purpose of this is. So, essentially, there were a number of ways to bypass armour, whether you're talking about medieval or Renaissance Europe, or whether you're talking about 17th century India. There were certain ways that people came up for bypassing armour. One of those is to hit the person really, really hard with a really big and fairly heavy object, like a lance or a poleaxe or a cannonball. Another way is to shoot them with a relatively high velocity for the time projectile with a hard head, concentrating a lot of energy into a small point, such as a bow or a crossbow, okay, or perhaps even a ballista. But in hand-to-hand combat, one of the main ways that people tried to overcome armoured opponents was either by stabbing in places or cutting in places where the armour wasn't, aiming for faces and things like this, or in some cases puncturing through the armour with a point. And that's really what these specialised daggers were designed for. Now, what's specialised about them? There's essentially two main things. There's the hilt and there's the blade, fundamentally, okay? Now, what we find is in medieval Europe, they came up with a very different solution to, let's say, 17th century India, and we're going to be looking at Indian comparisons. So they're solving the same problem, but with different technology. And that's one of the things I want you to take away from this video, if you take nothing else away from it, is the fact that different cultures can face the same or a very similar problem and come up with a different piece of technology to overcome that problem. So I think there's sometimes a kind of assumption or expectation in the modern world that we end up with the same technological answer to a given technological problem. And it's not the case. Sometimes different people, different cultures, people in different environments come up with different answers for the same question, okay, which I find really interesting as an archaeologist and someone who did some degree of anthropology mixed in with that as well. So, the rondel dagger is very clearly a specialised weapon to deal with armoured opponents. It has a narrow, very thick blade, usually some form of reinforced tip, a cross-section that's conducive to punching through particularly mail, but also padding. And as we've seen, it can penetrate through plate, but that certainly wasn't what it was primarily intended for. Now, in case you don't know, and I'm sure most people watching this channel do know, the medieval knight, where there isn't plate, there is mail. So if we look at the treatises which detail how to use these weapons, it's pretty much, whether it's a dagger or a sword or a poleaxe point, it's pretty much always about stabbing the point somewhere that the plate isn't. Now, Fiore and other authors do mention the penetrating of plate and other plate defences. So he specifically talks about using the point of a poleaxe to penetrate a corazina, in other words, a form of like brigandine or coat of plates. However, primarily they're stabbing into gaps, armpits, anywhere around the face, visor, things like this that might be gaps, under the skirts of the armour, back of the legs, inside of the elbow, this kind of places, back of the gauntlet, these kind of places. But nevertheless, if you meet mail, you do need a strong point, a strong blade with a cross section that is going to burst rings, perhaps even multiple rings, and still go in. And secondly, you need a secure grip. Okay, so bear those two things in mind. The headline here are a blade which will penetrate mail specifically, aka chainmail, mail armour. So you need a blade that will penetrate mail, and a hilt that will be really secure in your grip and give you a good platform for delivering energy to the target, but also be very good at staying in your grip in a combat scenario. So very difficult to get out of your grip, very secure in your grip, able to apply a lot of force to a blade which is designed to penetrate mail. So this primarily was the main solution that Europeans came up with in the 14th, 15th and 16th centuries. This is the specialised armour penetrator of medieval and Renaissance Europe. But as you probably know, completely different solution in India, it is this, the katar. Now actually, these two historical weapons appear completely different objects. Okay, they're both daggers, but apart from that, they appear to be completely different types of design. But they're fundamentally actually extremely similar. Because remember those 2 points. A blade that is designed to puncture through armour, mail specifically. This is massively reinforced. Look how thick this blade is here. Okay, you don't bother doing that, making that point as thick as it is and essentially a square section at the tip, unless you're penetrating something extremely resistant. Not a body, not flesh, not padded armour. Doesn't help with any of those things. It helps with bursting mail. That is a mail penetrating point. Okay, and secondly, the grip. Look at that grip, an utterly specialised design that once your hand is in it, it is going nowhere. It can't go forwards, it can't go backwards, it can't go sideways. Trying to get that out of the grip is incredibly difficult. Obviously, a dagger with a conventional grip is delivered in a normal stabbing motion, whether it's point up or point down, whereas this is delivered in a punching motion. However, fundamentally, they're achieving the same goal. It's delivering energy to a reinforced tip to puncture mail with a hilt that keeps your hand in place. So that is probably a 19th century, in the 18th century style, could even be an 18th century one with the gold Koftgari on it, Qatar. That is Northern Indian, probably from the Punjab or perhaps around Delhi, but certainly I would say Northern India. Okay, now we're going to look at a different example, and this is quite an old one, and this is sometimes known as a Tanjore. It's a Southern Indian Qatar with a rather different design to the other one. Okay, so if you notice, I mean, fundamentally they are both Qatar. They're both part of the same fundamental family of weapons. But this is made of one piece of steel whereby, or at least it's forge welded, but the bars of the hilt are one solid piece with the blade. Okay, and that's typical of the Northern Indian ones. The Southern Indian ones actually use a construction that's more like the pata, which you might be familiar with, which is a gauntlet sword, as it's sometimes called in the West, whereby you have a blade which is riveted through these languettes. So there's languettes either side, and there are, in this case, 3 rivets holding the blade to the hilt. So if you wanted to change this, you'd just have to pop out those rivets, drill them out. You could put a different blade on here, even a sword blade if you wanted, with the same hilt. And it's got a somewhat different shape. It's got these very broad kind of languettes that come down here. They usually got pierced decoration along here. Very often these bulbous knobs in the middle, and this quite kind of swollen cup section at the base of the blade here. And as I say, these 2 sort of leaf-like tongues which come up either side of the blade and are riveted through and grip the blade from each side. So very interesting construction method. Very often these have European blades married to Indian-made hilts. This might be European blade, it's very difficult to say. I'll talk about the blade in a second. But fundamentally, we've got the same features here, again, as the European rondel dagger. It is a hilt designed to keep your hand absolutely locked in place. You'll notice this is a narrower one, so I can only fit 3 fingers in there, so I have to put my pinky finger outside. But it keeps your hand absolutely locked into that hilt. It can't move forwards or backwards, exactly like the rondel dagger. It can't move forwards or backwards because of the rondels. And it absolutely locks you in, and then the blade. Right, so the blade here is, again, it's a very different blade to this one, obviously much narrower. But this, ironically, is actually more like the rondel dagger blade. You'll notice they're about the same length. They're both pretty damned thick, and they both have interesting cross sections. So this particular one, you will see it actually has a really strong midrib running down one side and is flat on the other side. Isn't that cool? And you only really have a blade like that if you want it to be incredibly stiff. Now, some of you might point out that bayonet blades are sometimes this kind of cross section, and small sword blades, and small swords and bayonets weren't designed really principally to go through armour. They were just designed for stabbing. They're about having a long blade that's completely stiff and less likely to bend. Okay, so you could argue, yes, in this case, that blade, we can't say for certain that this was designed with armour penetration in mind, but we have to add in other context. We add in other context that the Qatar is known throughout India as a close quarters dagger for use, particularly in armoured fighting, and a lot of them do have reinforced tips. And if you're in armoured fighting, you are more likely to come into wrestling distance and wrestling situations where the sword ceases to become as useful as it normally is, and the dagger might become a better weapon to pull out in that scenario than trying to use the sword or spear or whatever you had in your hand primarily. So as a backup weapon for armoured fighting, the Qatar was incredibly useful, and indeed this sort of tip I suspect, I haven't tested it, I suspect would be rather successful at punching through male armour. So, there we go. Europe and India, with similar reasons and motivations, came to completely different, in one way, completely different looking objects that might be held in a different way, but actually they fulfill very, very similar criteria. A blade that's designed to go through armour and a hilt that's designed to be incredibly secure to hold and enable you to apply as much energy to that acute tip as possible. Hope that's been interesting, useful. Maybe you learned something new. Any other questions you've got about this or things you'd like me to cover in future videos related to either of these weapons, going into perhaps more of a deep dive on katars? I probably need to do that at some point. I have been Matt Easton and will of course continue to be. I hope I see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.